When talking about the most important events in English history, the Norman Conquest led by William, Duke of Normandy, later known as the Conqueror, has to be one of the first things to come to mind. This conquest not only irreversibly changed the course of English history, and by extension world history, with its overthrow of the Anglo-Saxon kings, but indeed also influenced the very language we are speaking right now. But why exactly did the Normans decide to invade back in 1066, and what caused their ultimate victory over the Anglo-Saxon forces led by Harold Godwinson? Well, those are the questions I'm going to be answering in today's video, with the history of the Norman conquest of England. So, with that intro out the way, let's get straight into it. The beginnings of this fascinating part of English history can ultimately be traced back to the emergence of the Normans in France in the early 10th century. The origins of the Normans go back to a group of Viking raiders led by Rollo, who were allowed in 911 by the Carolingian French ruler Charles the Simple to settle in Normandy as part of a treaty on the condition that the Norsemen would protect West Francia's northern border from their countrymen's raids. This settlement soon proved very successful, with thousands of Norsemen settling in the land which became known as Normandy in reference to the Northmen who now called it home. These newcomers quickly adopted French practices and assimilated into the pre-existing culture, adopting the old French language and intermarrying with the local population. A key moment in regards to their relationship with England would come in 1002 when the English king Aethelred the Unready married Emma of Normandy, the sister of Richard II, Duke of Normandy. Following years of political upheaval in England, it would ultimately be their son, known as Edward the Confessor, who had spent many years in exile in Normandy, who succeeded to the English throne in 1042, following the death of the last Danish king of England, Arthur Canute, who himself was actually also a son of Emma of Normandy, following her second marriage to Canute the Great. Following Edward's ascension to the throne, the Normans unsurprisingly gained a significant amount of influence in the kingdom, as Edward relied heavily on his mainland relatives for support, bringing in Norman courtiers, soldiers, and clerics, in the process appointing many of them to positions of power in England, particularly in the church. All this makes it plausible, as was later claimed by William, that being childless and in conflict with the powerful Anglo-Saxon Godwinson family, at this time led by Godwin, Earl of Wessex, Edward may have encouraged William, Duke of Normandy, who was actually a bastard of Robert I and a great-great-grandson of Rollo's, ambitions for the English throne, or otherwise outright promised it to him upon his death, though this is debated. Regardless of what exactly was said between Edward and William over the course of their years-long relationship, William remained keenly aware of the threat the Godwinsons posed to his ambitions. This awareness would be on full display in 1064 when Harold Godwinson, the eldest surviving son of the previously mentioned Godwin, arrived in Normandy, possibly to obtain the release of his nephew Hakon and youngest brother Wulfneth, who had been in Norman captivity since 1051, though the exact details of why and how he made his way to Normandy remain debated. Nonetheless, it would later be claimed that, as depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, during his stay Harold swore an oath on sacred relics to William to support his claim to the English throne, which will become important very soon. It is possible he only did this under the implied or literal threat to his family, or some other duress, potentially practically being William's prisoner at the time, but again the exact details are lost to history and remain hotly debated today. Back in England, in the following years, the now in his early 60s Edward the Confessor's health began to fail, suffering a series of strokes which ultimately led to his death on the 6th of January 1066. Further complicating the already messy and bound for violent succession was the claim of Harold Godwinson, who stated that on his deathbed Edward had promised or otherwise impressed upon him that he, rather than William, should succeed him to the English throne. Regardless of the reality of this claim, Harold seized the opportunity to take the kingship, immediately having himself crowned King of England by the Witan later that same day. This predictably greatly angered William, who, upon hearing the news, began assembling a large invasion fleet sourced from not only Normandy but many other parts of France, including large contingents from Brittany and Flanders. This almighty army, which is believed to have comprised around 5,000 to 8,000 men, was stationed at Saint-Valery-sur-Somme and was ready to cross the Channel by about the 12th of August. Unfortunately for the Normans though, poor winds prevented the ships from setting sail for about a month and a half, though this potentially wasn't the only reason for the delay. It is possible that William had received reports from England, revealing that Harold's forces were deployed along the coast, with William understandably preferring to delay the invasion until he could make an unopposed landing. Regardless of the exact reasons, this delay would prove crucial to William's later success, as it was fatefully during this time that a third claimant to the throne, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, backed by the English king's own brother Tostig, landed in northern England and defeated an army led by the northern earls at Fulford. This new threat from the north forced Harold to reassemble his army, which he had just disbanded due to a lack of supplies and his peasant soldiers' need to return home for their harvests, and march them all the way north to face the Northmen, which he promptly did, surprising Hardrada by the speed of their march and decisively defeating them at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, where both Hardrada and Tostig fell. Fatefully, it would be just a few days after this great English victory that William's forces landed at Pevensey in Sussex on the 28th of September, promptly erecting a wooden castle at Hastings, from which they raided the surrounding area to ensure the army's supplies. It is unclear when exactly Harold got the catastrophic news of William's landing, though it was likely on his march back to the south, forcing him to hasten his and his army's return. Following their exhausting march back down to the south, in which the English army averaged an astonishing 43 kilometers or 27 miles per day, Harold decided to stop in London for about a week in order for his army to rest and to increase their strength. It was here in London that it is believed Gurth Godwinson, one of Harold's younger brothers, urged the king to remain in London and allow him to lead the army south to face William, so Harold could lead a second battle if necessary against the Normans, all the while also reminding his brother of the oath he had sworn to William. Fatefully, Harold ignored his brother's advice and began his army's march south, accompanied by his two remaining brothers, the aforementioned Gurth and the youngest Leofwine, who was in his early 30s at the time. The exact size of this English force is debated, though most historians agree on a range of between 7,000 to 8,000, almost the exact same size as the invading Norman host. The exact details of the ensuing battle are once again debated, though the mostly accepted version is that on the day of the battle, William led his army from his castle and advanced towards the English, who had taken a defensive position at the top of Senlac Hill, about 6 miles or 9.7 kilometers away. It is thought that Harold had intended to surprise the Normans, though William's scouts ensured this didn't come to pass. Either way, the battle that would irreversibly change English history began on the morning of the 14th of October 1066. The English maintained their defensive position at the top of the hill, forming a formidable shield wall from which they repeatedly repelled the Normans' advances, causing heavy casualties. These casualties were so severe that it is believed some of William's Breton troops panicked and began fleeing, causing an all-out rout, during which rumours of William's death swept through the forces, further depleting their courage and will to fight. However, William, being very much still alive, was then said to have removed his helmet and begun shouting at his men, assuring them that he was still alive, before rallying them to turn on and encircle the pursuing English, many of whom had broken rank, believing victory was imminent, with it being possible that it was in this manoeuvre that Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine were killed, although a contemporary priest/chronicler, William of Poitiers, states that the bodies of the brothers were found near Harold's, implying they died later in the battle, perhaps attempting to protect Harold, but it is also possible their bodies may have been taken to Harold, likely influencing his decision to stand and fight to the end if that had been the case. Yet another contemporary source, though, written shortly after the invasion, states that Gurth was actually killed by William himself, who potentially believed he had killed Harold. All this means that while we can speculate, which I for one enjoy doing, the exact circumstances of the deaths of Harold's brothers remains unclear. Be that as it may, the Normans continued to use this feinting retreat tactic twice more to devastating effect, greatly thinning the English shield wall. However, despite their weakened state, the shield wall still held firm in face of the persistent and revitalized Normans. The ultimate turning point in the battle would finally come late in the afternoon when Harold was killed, most likely by an arrow to the eye as depicted in the Bayeux tapestry, leaving the English forces leaderless in the light of his brother's earlier deaths, causing them to begin to collapse. Many soldiers fled, quickly pursued by the Normans. However, the soldiers of the royal household gathered around Harold's body and bravely fought fought to the last man. Despite that fact, Harold's body was not actually identified until the day after the battle, either by his armor or marks on his body, with the fallen king's mother, Geitha, then offering the victorious William the weight of her son's body in gold for its safe return to her, presumably to receive a proper burial. However, William refused and instead ordered that Harold's body be thrown into the sea, though whether that actually took place is unclear. As for the bodies of the other English dead, including Harold's brothers, they were for the most part simply left on the battlefield, although some were later collected by relatives. Following this decisive Norman victory, which many historians believe to have been mostly due to both William's superior tactics and experience as a military leader, as well as the Norman use of cavalry, which allowed them more flexibility, the victorious Duke may have hoped or even expected the remaining English to quickly submit to him. However, this would prove to be far from the truth, as the English quickly proclaimed Edgar Atheling, the great nephew of Edward the Confessor, as king. In response to this, William led his forces around the coast of Kent and up to London, where he met an English force led by a powerful English noble named Ansgar, who had actually been wounded at Hastings, but returned to London in the aftermath to organise a defence against the Norman invaders. Despite the fact that his wounds were so severe that he was not capable of walking and had to be carried around in a litter, he managed to muster a sizable and formidable force. This statement is supported by the fact that William reportedly made an offer to Ansgar that he could retain his titles and even join William's council if he recognised him as king. Ansgar refused the offer, however, and chose to fight the Normans at the town of Southwick, now a district of central London. The 500 Norman knights, led by William, managed to defeat this English force at Southwick and advanced towards the London Bridge. However, there they were repelled by an unexpectedly fierce defence. Unable to cross London Bridge, the Normans opted to retreat, but not before setting the town of Southwick ablaze, reducing almost the entire town to ash. William then moved up the Thames Valley to cross the river at Wallingford in modern-day Berkshire. Following the river crossing, he travelled northeast along the Chilterns, before advancing once more towards London, this time from the northwest, fighting further engagements against the forces from the city in the process. Despite the English's so far fierce resistance, by this point it was apparent to the young King Edward's leading supporters that it was a lost cause, resulting in them surrendering to William soon after at Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire. Following this surrender, William was acclaimed King of England and crowned by Ealdred, a key figure in Anglo-Saxon England, on the 25th of December 1066 in Westminster Abbey. After his coronation, the new King of England attempted to discourage any revolts against him by confirming the northern lords of Morcar, Edwin and Waltheof positions, and even giving Edgar Atheling some land. William remained in England until March 1067, then returning back home to Normandy, accompanied by many English prisoners, including all of those aforementioned figures he had confirmed the positions of. Despite these prisoners, William was not foolish enough to leave England unguarded. As it became apparent, resistance would continue for some time. For this duty, he chose his half-brother through his mother, Otto, who had fought with William at Hastings and was a proven commander and military leader in his own right. These skills would soon come in handy, as the same year William left the country, rebels in Kent launched an ultimately unsuccessful attack on Dover Castle with the support of one of William's continental rivals. Later on that year, the Shropshire landowner known as Eardric the Wild, in alliance with the Welsh rulers of Gwynedd and Powys, raised a revolt in western Mercia, fighting the Normans based in Hereford. This resistance eventually forced William to return to England at the end of 1067 to help stabilise the situation. The next year, in 1068, William, now back in England, besieged rebels based in Exeter, including even Harold's mother, Geitha, and after suffering heavy losses, managed to negotiate the town's surrender. A few months later, another revolt broke out, this time led by Edwin and Morcar, who raised a revolt in Mercia with Welsh assistance. All the while, yet another rebellion was sparked independently in Northumbria, which was actually yet to be occupied by the Normans, led by a noble named Gospatric. Unfortunately for the English, these rebellions rapidly collapsed as William moved against them one by one, building castles and installing garrisons as he had already done in the south in the process. Edwin and Morcar eventually submitted for the second time, while Gospatric fled to Scotland accompanied by Edgar Atheling and his family, who may have been involved in some of these revolts. Also during this time, Harold Godwinson's sons, who had taken refuge in Ireland following their father's defeat, raided Somerset, Devon and Cornwall from the sea, though never solidifying a permanent hold on the mainland. You would be wrong if you thought that this would be the end of the revolts, however, as in early 1069 the newly installed Norman Earl of Northumbria, Robert de Comines, and several hundred of his soldiers were massacred at Durham, which was followed by yet another rebellion in the area led by Edgar, Gospatrick, Seward Barn, and other rebels who had fled to Scotland. The rebellious English managed to defeat and kill the castellan of York, Robert Fitzrichard, before besieging the large town itself. These successes forced William to once again march north, where he defeated the rebels outside York before pursuing them into the city, massacring the inhabitants, and bringing the revolt to a bloody end. Sometime following this, Harold's sons launched a second raid from Ireland, this time getting a foothold on the mainland, before being defeated at the Battle of Northam in Devon by Norman forces under Count Brian of Penthevere. Several more revolts continued to break out throughout the country that year, most notably being yet another northern one led by the same people, this time with the support of the Danes under King Sweyn II, who were eventually paid off and agreed to leave the country. After this, with the Danes back in Denmark, William then turned his eyes back to the rebellious English, and it was here that he decided to implement a ruthless strategy of cutting off the rebel army's sources of support and their food supply in an act that became known as the Harrying of the North. This strategy, if that's what you wish to call it, has been described by many modern scholars as an act of genocide against the English, with even contemporary biographers of William considering it to be his cruelest act and a stain upon his soul. Writing about the harrying over 50 years later, the Anglo-Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote that the king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. This made a real change. To his shame, William made no efforts to control his fury, punishing the innocent with the guilty. He ordered that crops and herds, tools and food be burned to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of starvation. I have often praised William in this book, but I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him. This merciless violence against the North brought the whole area to its knees, with some modern historians stating that up to 75 to 80% of the population of northern England died as a result, a number supported by records from the later Domesday Book of 1086. This catastrophic, to say the least, event in the north effectively crushed all resistance and forced Edgar and his remaining supporters back up to Scotland once again. Following this, William moved south to Mercia, basing himself at Chester and crushing all remaining resistance in the region before returning to the south. Things would not remain quiet for long though, as not too long later, in 1070, Sweyn II of Denmark arrived to take personal command of his fleet and renounced the Danes' earlier agreement with William to withdraw, sending troops into the Fens, which at the time were a marshy area, to join forces with English rebels led by Hereward the Wake, who at the time were based on the Isle of Ely. The Danes would not remain in England for long though, and quickly accepted a further payment of Danegeld from William, once again returning home without conflict. The English rebels would prove harder to get rid of though, as they remained at large, largely protected by the harsh and difficult to pass marshland area they had set up base in. Things would reach a boiling point in 1071 though, as the brothers Edwin and Morcar turned against William once again, and although Edwin was quickly betrayed and killed, Morcar managed to reach Ely, where he and Hereward were joined by exiled rebels who had sailed down from Scotland. William soon arrived with an army and a fleet to finish off this last pocket of resistance in England, and after some costly failures managed to construct a pontoon in order to reach the Isle before defeating the rebels at the bridgehead and storming the island, finally marking the effective end of English resistance. In the aftermath, Morcar was imprisoned for the rest of his life, though Hereward was pardoned and even had his lands returned to him. Believing his position was now secure, William then returned back to France to deal with yet more challenges he faced over there, before returning to England in 1072 to march north and confront King Malcolm III of Scotland, ultimately forcing him to submit and agree to some degree of subordination to William, also expelling Edgar the Aethelring from Scotland. I have more information about that conflict in my video about the Scots though, so if you want to know more about it and the history of Scotland in general, you should definitely check it out. After this Scottish campaign, things remained quiet for a few years, with William going back home to Normandy, leaving England in the hands of his brother and other loyal men. These loyal men would soon be called upon, as a few years later, in 1075, yet another plot came to be known as the Revolt of the Earls, led by Ralph de Gale, Earl of Norfolk, and Roger de Breteuil, Earl of of Hereford, who was actually a distant relative of William's, broke out with the aim of overthrowing him. William himself didn't even bother to return to England for this revolt initially, only deciding to cross the Channel in late 1075 to deal with a Danish force which had been called upon by Ralph. Though by the time these Danes arrived, Ralph had already surrendered, so they simply raided the coast of England before returning home. William didn't stay in England for long though, and quickly returned to the continent, where Ralph had actually managed to make his way to, and continue the rebellion in Brittany with the support of some Breton lords. The failure of this plot ultimately marked the end of any resistance to the Normans and William in England, with William going on to spend the remainder of his life mostly in Normandy, ruling England from a distance without much need to return, a trend carried on by his successors until Normandy itself was fully conquered in 1204. That is a story for another day however, so I think I'm going to end the video there. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. With all that being said though, if you're still here, you're a legend, and as always, I hope you have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you in the next one.